Okay, guys, what's going on? Josh here from Polymathics, the YouTube channel that helps you become a modern day Renaissance man. And today we're going to talk about, really quick, what is the difference between a narrator, a main character, a protagonist, and a hero. Because these are terms that are very similar, that get mixed around a lot. But when you understand the difference, you can begin, when you're looking at your story, you can make an educated decision about what route you want to take rather than being confused. And just so everybody knows, this is a continuation from, or sort of a follow-up from a video I did earlier today. I did it live on the air where I basically discussed like what makes a hero heroic. But in this video, let's talk about some of the differences. So here in this first picture, what we have is a picture of Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. And most people, whether they read literature or not, know the general story about Moby Dick. Essentially, you have this dude named Ishmael who meets up with a captain named Ahab who has lost a limb to a whale, and he's super angry about it. He thinks the whale is a demon sent from hell, and basically his mission is to destroy this whale. And long story short, most people know Captain Ahab ends up dying trying to catch the whale, and so does his crew. Ishmael is actually the only one who makes it out alive. So with that little summary, let's actually take a look here. Here's a picture of Ishmael from, I'm assuming, a film about Moby Dick. I actually haven't seen this film, so but when we talk about a narrator and a main character, many times they're very similar. For example, in this story, Moby Dick, Ishmael serves as both. Ishmael is the narrator because he's the one who kind of tells the entire story. It's all told by him as he is now older compared to when he actually went on the adventure. He's also the main character because the story is told primarily, well, entirely from his point of view. But a story doesn't have to be told entirely from one's point of view in order to make them a main character. It just needs to be told primarily from their point of view in order to make them a main character. If you look, I don't have pictures, but if you have ever read the Ender's Game series, that's a good example of a book where the majority of it is written from Ender's point of view. However, there are times where we get to see Graf's point of view or another character's in a scene or two, very short scenes. Also, let's take a look at this narrator's point of view, right? In order to be a narrator, that doesn't mean you tell the entire story, but it means you're presenting almost this godlike narration above the story. And so that's why he also is the narrator, because this is Ishmael coming back after he's gone on the adventure, telling us about what he did. Another good example of this is almost all of the X-Men movies start off with Professor X, young or old, or sometimes I think Wolverine, saying something about mutants. And so in that sense, they are the narrator. This doesn't make them the hero, doesn't make them the protagonist. It just means that they're narrating a piece of the story from some sort of omniscient, godlike standpoint. Whereas the main character, as I said before, that's where the majority of the point of view of the story will be seen from. They're the eyes for the audience to see and view the world through. So when we look at this story, this first story of Moby Dick, many people are confused and believe that Captain Ahab is the main character. Many people believe that he, or not necessarily believe, but they misinterpret the term main character, and they believe he's the main character, when in all reality he's the protagonist. For all intents and purposes, I mean, Ishmael in the beginning, he kind of pushes the journey just in that very beginning, where before he meets up with Ahab, he's kind of a sailor who wants to go whaling to make money, and he's kind of depressed from land life, and he wants to go out on the open sea, because if not, he feels like, you get the sense that he'll commit suicide if he doesn't get off the land. But beyond that, once they meet Ahab and they enlist in his crew, Ahab is the main driver throughout the story that really pushes it into the unknown world for Ishmael, and pushes them forward and forward, trying to go towards that ultimate climactic moment against Moby Dick. And so he's the protagonist, and the thing that makes a protagonist is they are the driving force. So just, this is the way I would imagine it. If I'm in a car, the protagonist is the one driving the car, but maybe the main character is the one that I'm actually viewing everything from. Like, I'm sitting in the passenger seat viewing everything, but my wife or a friend is the one in the driver's seat actually driving the car. And the narrator, you could imagine, is somebody just sitting in the back seat talking about all the things that are flying by that they can see. So, I mean, if you're going to use an analogy, that's kind of how I would use it. The thing about, so then the question is, okay, if Ishmael is the narrator and the main character, and Ahab is the protagonist, then who the hell is the hero of the story? And here's what I would say. Overall, they're both heroes. One is tragic and one is not. But overall, Ishmael is really, truly the one who commits the heroic deed, in the sense, according to mythology, according to the hero's journey, according to the monomyth, a hero isn't just someone who goes out into the unknown world, into the special world or the magic world, and does something. There's someone who goes there, retrieves a boon, which is sometimes physical, sometimes ethereal, right? It's like a psychological truth. And then they bring it back to society in order to revitalize society. That's kind of what my other video was about. So if you look at these two characters, Ahab, he's a hero in the sense that he's a tragic hero. He had pretty much a negative character arc. He started out as a sailor, going whaling, and then he loses his leg, which we don't really see that part in the story. We hear glimpses of it told kind of after the fact. But then once we meet Ahab, we see like he's kind of crazed. His rage just gets worse and worse, and he starts going down this downhill spiral into a negative character arc. So instead of what makes him a tragic hero is basically, instead of overcoming his flaw and denying the lie that he believes, he is embracing the lie and going deeper and deeper, basically fueling his flaw until he meets a tragic end. Ishmael, on the other hand, and then if we were to actually look at the sailors in the story of the crew, I mean, they basically all die. And while I wouldn't say that they would be considered kind of a flat arc or no arc, because the sailors kind of go into this whole adventure believing that whales are dangerous, and they kind of project a lot of the dangers of their own lives and livelihood and jobs and occupation onto the whales. But they're not as obsessed as Ahab, but they do. I mean, they end up dying, and I think there's a message there that, basically they didn't come out with any kind of respect or idea of what a whale actually is. Whereas if we go and we look at Ishmael, who again I believe is the true hero of the story for multiple reasons. First, he is the one who starts out on the adventure in the known world, in the mundane world, and he's the one who kind of he's the one that grows and matures throughout the adventure. He has a positive character arc, a maturation arc, where when he comes back and now he's telling the story, we're assuming years later, he has a respect and a knowledge for whales that he didn't have before. And he never became as obsessed as not just Ahab, but the other sailors in terms of demonizing these whales. Throughout the whole entire story, he essentially gives you all different kinds of facts and figures about whales, trying to help the reader understand that whales are more than some demonic creature. But on the flip side, one of the other kind of motifs that Melville puts in that story is that, you know, a whale is kind of this unknown creature that one can never know. But anyways, that's beyond the scope of the conversation. The point is, Ishmael serves as the hero because he's the one who brings the boon back really to society in order to revitalize it. And the boon is basically the lesson that you can't be an Ahab. You can't go chasing after your white whale and be so obsessed about it that it drives you mad or it drives you to a tragic end. And so that's the lesson that he brings back. One of them, at least, one of the key main lesson that he brings back. So moving along here now, we're going to go look at one more kind of older piece of literature, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. And so here we have Atticus Finch and his daughter Scout. And again, people will say, well, okay, who is the main character? Who is the protagonist? Well, now we know. The main character is Scout. The majority of the story, if not all of the story, is told from her point of view. And because of that, the readers, they don't know just enough to have this curiosity and kind of innocence about them. But they also know enough about the people and what's going on to make educated speculations. And that's the really great thing about using this kind of tomboy child who isn't familiar with the grown-up world to look at this very grown-up situation where her father, who is a lawyer defending, you know, this supposed criminal, he is the protagonist that's driving the story. He's the one that's like pushing forward all of this information in terms of the court hearing and everything that's going on there. So again, so here we have another example from literature where we have the protagonist is different than the main character. Overall, though, I would say, again, that in this one, the real hero is going to end up being Scout because she's the one who really drives the lesson home. She's the one that has a positive arc in the sense, like, she's no longer naively holding on to, I don't want to say her innocence, but like she's maturing. She's reaching her fuller self by understanding the grown-up world in a way that she didn't know at the beginning of the story. And allowing the readers to go through that transformation also allows them to see both the innocent side, but also how different the world is when we look at it from, this very, almost, what's the word, like monstrous point of view. The world is scary, especially to a child. And it's full of strange and weird things that adults do. So now, the reason why I started with those is because those are two really good examples from two well-known literature stories that really, really show you that you can have a protagonist and a main character and a narrator. Like, you can have all different types of things, but the hero has a specific job, the protagonist has a specific job. Now we're going to go into some more contemporary stories where you have a mix of a lot, right? So just because someone is the main character doesn't mean they can't also be the protagonist. doesn't mean that they can't also be the hero. And so here we have Katniss, who serves as all three in the Hunger Games. And she goes from her known world, which is District 12, into Panem, and eventually the games themselves. And she comes out, and she has the lesson that she uses to revitalize the society is that it's okay to rebel if you're faced against a tyrannical government. And in the sequels and whatnot, it just that keeps hitting home like harder and harder. So you have Katniss, who serves as protagonist, main character, and hero. Then you also have Harry Potter, same thing. He's the protagonist, he's the main character, and he's the hero. He goes on a very similar kind of adventure as Katniss, in the sense that he's in this unknown world where he's kind of like an orphan, and then he's thrown into the wizarding world. He has to learn all of these new things, and then, in the end, the lesson that he learns is that like unconditional love is more powerful than any kind of magic, even the darkest magic from the darkest wizard. So now moving along here, one of my favorites, we have Luke Skywalker. And Luke, just like Katniss and in Harry Potter, serves as the protagonist, the main character, and the hero in the original Star Wars trilogy, particularly in the first one, A New Hope. And he has a very strong positive arc in that one, where he matures. He matures from this kid who's unsure of himself, who takes advice and orders from foster parent-like figures rather than trusting his own gut feeling, to this rebel who is willing to go up against this tyrannical government, and rather than using his systematic targeting system, he taps into his intuition, into his gut feeling, and uses that in order to blow up the Death Star. And so, like I said, in A New Hope, Luke serves as all three. But a case could be made that for the entire Star Wars, like if you're talking about the prequels and the original trilogy, if you put them together, the real story is about Anakin and both his fall in a negative arc, where he's this Jedi who, through a series of unfortunate events, essentially falls from grace, and he's one of the top Jedi with a promising career, very talented, and ends up being manipulated, and he believes in his lie, and therefore he embraces more and more of his flaws and his insecurities until he essentially succumbs to the dark side. And because of that, he becomes half man, half machine. He becomes Darth Vader. Now, the reason why I bring up Anakin and Vader is because not only are their stories kind of the overarching story of the whole 6 films, but also a case could be made that for episode 5 and 6, Vader is actually the hero. He's not necessarily the main character, he's not necessarily the protagonist, but when we look at Luke's maturation after episode 4, while he learns more about the Force and becoming a Jedi, and he faces his father, he has this inner truth that he's learned, and he doesn't really change much after that. But Vader, in those 2 films, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Vader starts to take a positive arc, a redemption arc, back to the good side, where he does start to reject the lie and embrace the truth and remember that he was once a real person. He wasn't just a machine that worked for a systematic government. He was a person that had a family that loved him, and that he has a son and a daughter that are worth essentially dying for. So so there we have Vader. Now I'm going to go into the Lord of the Rings, because they have heroes that go through very similar stories as Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, and Katniss Everdeen. But the interesting thing here is we have multiple heroes in the same books kind of participating as different levels of a hero. And I'm going to give you two examples. In The Hobbit, you have Bilbo, who I would say serves as, well, he definitely serves as the protagonist. I'm sorry, he definitely serves as the main character, but I would also say that he is probably the main hero. He's the one that we see leave on the journey from Hobbiton, and he's the one in the final film or the final book comes back to Hobbiton in the journey. And he kind of brings back that lesson. However, there is a secondary hero that is just as equally important, which is Thorin Oakenshield. And the reason for that is because Thorin not only serves as the protagonist in this adventure, he's the one that's continually driving the story, very similar to Ahab, and he meets a very similar end. He's somewhat of a tragic hero, but where he succeeds and Ahab fails is that Thorin, in the end, was redeemed, very similar to Darth Vader, where, yes, he dies, he meets a tragic end at the end of his life, kind of like King Lear as well, but he does it in such a way that he restores balance to society. He kills the white orc. And, while we're looking at symbolism here a little bit, there is a huge similarity in the symbolism of the white orc and the white whale. And the fact that you have Melville writing about a guy who's madly obsessed with killing this white whale, where you have Tolkien over here writing about a king who has a chip on his shoulder, who's actually kind of running away from the white orc, who he thinks he's already defeated. So there's a lot of very interesting parallels going on there. But the thing that's cool is, when you look at the real requirements for a hero, the two main things are that there's a sacrifice towards the end. They have to sacrifice themselves. Normally this means they have to sacrifice their lie that they have come to love and enjoy and embrace their flaws. They have to sacrifice that. They have to get rid of that comfort zone, and sometimes even sacrifice themselves in order to restore that balance to society and revitalize it. The other thing they have to do is they have to bring it back to society. And so that's where this is very interesting that Tolkien does this in this story, because he also does it in Lord of the Rings. But you have the main character / hero, Bilbo, who goes on this adventure and whatnot, but he's not a protagonist, and he doesn't necessarily make the sacrifice. But what he does do is he's the one who kind of brings the story home. He brings the lesson home. If it wasn't for Bilbo's retelling of the story, but also his perspective from the story, not just us, but people of Middle Earth wouldn't quite understand the value of the adventure. So Bilbo is a hero in and of his own right. Thorin, who is basically the protagonist / hero hybrid, he never gets to bring the story or the lesson back to society. But like I said before, through killing the white orc, Azog, he is able to restore balance. And the only way he was able to do that was he not by accident, but purposefully sacrificed himself. And through that act of sacrifice, what he really was saying was that the truly heroic deed, the truly kingly deed that a person does is not to assert power over people and close their doors. It's to make sacrifices so that those who don't have power can live freely. It's a really great message in Thorin Oakenshield's story. So now let's go to our final heroes that we're going to take a look at, which are Lord of the Rings heroes. We have Aragorn, we have Frodo, and we have Samwise. And so essentially we have a very similar kind of melding here where, you know, in the first story, Aragorn, he's not necessarily a throwaway character by any means, but he's almost more like a mentor figure or an ally. He's kind of like the Han Solo, where you kind of feel like he's already a hero, but he doesn't really have much more to go. Like, he's not really going to change much. And had he stayed just Strider, that's probably what would have happened. But instead, in the second and third books, the meat of it, I actually feel as though, you know, it's not only about returning the ring to Mount Doom, but it's really about taking the kingly crown back for mankind. And the symbolism there is that, you know, there are two ends of the spectrum. You know, in one end, the main theme of the story of all three books is that power corrupts and ultimate power corrupts ultimately, or totally. Total power corrupts totally. And so here you have Aragorn, who, unlike almost everybody else in the story, is actually trying to reject the power that is being given to him, that is his birthright. And so it's almost a duality or a dichotomy of messages here, where Tolkien is saying, yes, there are some very big risks to having power. However, if you approach it humbly and respectfully, as Aragorn did, and you have the support of everybody else in the community, then it's your duty to take on that leadership role and become quote-unquote king. And so Aragorn, he kind of serves as, he definitely serves as a hero because he restores balance to humankind. But ultimately, very similar to Bilbo, Frodo is the one who is not only I would say Frodo is definitely the main hero of the story, but if you were going to say that there was a main character, it would probably be Frodo. I mean, the scenes are split up, I don't want to say evenly, but like you do not see everything from Frodo's eyes. Whereas in The Hobbit and many of these other films we've talked about, the majority of the scenes are told from one specific character's eyes. So there could be a case made that there is no real main character in Lord of the Rings, which I would buy that argument because there are several scenes that are shown from other people's points of view. The two heroes, though, are Aragorn and Frodo, and I feel like just like you had in the Hobbit, you have Bilbo and Thorin. Thorin kind of represents what I would say people in power, whereas Bilbo represents common man. Same thing with Frodo and Aragorn. Aragorn represents people in these power positions, whereas Frodo represents more of a common man standpoint. And each one has very valuable lessons and themes that we can learn from throughout the story. But if we go back and we look at Frodo, he is the one who ultimately starts out on the adventure, gets called to the adventure, goes on this, meets mentor, goes on this crazy journey, gets allies, goes through trials, has the boon, and then eventually restores balance. Because ultimately, Frodo is the one who restores balance to Middle Earth. And the real kicker here, or the real where it's really hit home, is if you've seen the film version, when Aragorn takes the crown and then he approaches everybody kneels. And then when he approaches the hobbits, he basically tells the hobbits, hey, you guys, you kneel to nobody. And the purpose there is like, yeah, he may have restored balance to the kingdoms of man, but the hobbits, particularly Frodo, they're the ones that restored balance to the entire, or like the entire world that they live in, because they, specifically Frodo, destroyed the ring of power, meaning that he dissolved that corruption that was driving the evil in the world in the first place. So, so then the question is, all right, Josh, there you go. Why do you have a picture of Samwise on here? Sam is kind of like a mini hero, and I would say he also serves very similar to Frodo. But Sam is like the really, really common man who's like Frodo's kind of, if you compare the two, Frodo is this inquisitive hobbit who does pretty well in these adventure type situations, despite the fact that he doesn't really have any kind of true disposition towards it. Whereas Samwise, who is a gardener, has like no, he's just not that kind of person. And yet he goes on this adventure, and by the time he comes back, Sam, when you look, Frodo gives him the book, and there's so many things that happen. Frodo he goes to the Undying Lands, but Sam finally works up the courage to ask out, I think the girl's name is Molly from the tavern. Then they get married, then they have kids, then he writes more in the book. Like the point of Sam is to show like he too was a hero. Now granted, he may have been a sidekick to Frodo throughout the majority of the story, but the thing that Sam does is not only does he have a positive character arc, but he's the one, because like when you look at Frodo, when Frodo comes back, he's kind of got a flat character arc. Like he comes back and he's changed by the journey, but it's not like Frodo didn't start off wanting power of the ring or anything like that. He came back kind of the same way he did before. Like he's just a helper to people. He's just an all-around good guy. Sam, on the other hand, we see definite changes in the world that he comes back to. Whereas in the beginning of the story, when he was confronted with Molly and like the guys at the tavern, he was jealous, but he was too cowardly to ask her out. In the end of the story, because of all the adventures that they've gone on and everything that was entailed in, going to Mordor and stuff, like he knows there's no other time better than the present to ask her, and he has no fear because he's faced things far more terrible than going up to a girl and asking her, out on a date. And so we see there's a real maturation there. But not only that, then he has kids, and it's like you can see Sam went from being kind of this nobody gardener in Hobbiton to he's a true, real hero in his own right. So there you have it. I hope by now you guys have a clear understanding about the differences between a narrator, a main character, a protagonist, and a hero. And if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like. I know it was in depth, but sometimes I do that. If you would like to hear more, then please feel free to subscribe if you haven't. If you have somebody that you think, if you know somebody that you think might benefit from this information, go ahead and share the video. And of course, if you have any questions or you want to further this conversation, if you think I got something wrong, then go ahead and drop it in the comments below, and we'll continue the conversation that way. But until next time, you guys go ahead and take it easy.